In the hills of southeastern Turkey, about 35 miles north of the Syrian border, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt made a discovery in 1994 that quietly broke one of the most foundational assumptions in the study of human civilization. What Schmidt found on a hilltop called Göbekli Tepe, which translates roughly as Potbelly Hill in Turkish, was a complex of massive stone enclosures arranged in circular patterns, their T-shaped limestone pillars standing up to 20 feet tall and weighing as much as 10 tons each. The pillars were not simply rough-cut slabs. They were carved with an astonishing menagerie of animals: foxes, scorpions, vultures, lions, wild boar, and cranes, rendered in relief with a degree of artistic sophistication that nobody expected to find in this region at this point in time. Radiocarbon dating placed the site's construction at approximately 11,600 years ago, making it older than Stonehenge by roughly 6,000 years, older than the earliest Egyptian pyramids by more than 7,000 years, and older than the invention of the wheel, the development of pottery, and the first emergence of writing by several millennia. The assumption that Schmidt's discovery upended is one that archaeologists had treated for most of the 20th century as essentially settled. The standard model of civilizational development runs in a particular sequence. Human populations first develop agriculture, which produces food surplus, which in turn permits some members of the group to stop gathering food and instead specialize in other activities: construction, religion, governance, art. It is this surplus and the social organization that grows around managing it that allows large monuments to be built. Göbekli Tepe, according to the dating evidence, was constructed well before any of this had happened in the region. The people who built it, as best as current evidence can establish, were hunter-gatherers. This is where the evidence begins to create problems that have no fully satisfying resolution. A site of this scale, multiple large enclosures, each requiring the quarrying, transport, and erection of dozens of multi-ton pillars, demands a coordinated labor force. Experimental archaeology has suggested that raising a single pillar of this size would have required somewhere between 500 and 1,000 workers acting in concert. Sustaining that workforce over the years or decades that construction would have demanded requires reliable food supply, some form of hierarchical organization to direct the effort, and a social logic sophisticated enough to compel large numbers of people to participate in a shared project. All of that, by the conventional model, should not have been possible for a population without agriculture to support it. Yet the physical evidence at the site itself, the pillars, the enclosures, the carvings, is unambiguous. It was built. The question of how remains genuinely open. What makes that question particularly difficult to answer is the near total absence of the kinds of evidence that archaeologists rely on to understand how people lived. At Göbekli Tepe, there are no hearths. There are no post holes indicating houses or shelters. There are no trash middens, the accumulated refuse of daily domestic life that typically allow archaeologists to reconstruct diet, population size, and the rhythms of settlement. The surrounding landscape, at the time of construction, appears to have been used but not inhabited in any permanent sense. Schmidt himself spent years puzzling over this absence. His interpretation, which he developed and refined until his death in 2014, was that Göbekli Tepe was not a settlement at all, but a ritual or ceremonial center, a place that people traveled to for religious purposes and then left, which would explain why the signatures of ordinary domestic life are simply not there. That interpretation is broadly accepted among archaeologists today, but it generates its own set of unresolved tensions. A purely ceremonial site still requires the same logistical infrastructure as any other large construction project. Feeding and coordinating hundreds of workers, even temporarily, demands organizational capacity that seems to exceed what a dispersed hunter-gatherer population would ordinarily develop. Some scholars have proposed that the region may have supported a more sedentary or semi-sedentary population then the standard model suggests people who were in the process of transitioning toward agriculture rather than fully pre-agricultural. Others have pointed out that the site sits in an area of exceptional natural abundance, with wild stands of einkorn wheat and large populations of game animals that could potentially have supported a larger and more settled community than would be expected elsewhere. Neither of these arguments fully resolves the contradiction. They soften it somewhat without eliminating it. Schmidt's most provocative contribution to the debate was his inversion of the standard causal sequence. Rather than accepting that agriculture must have preceded a monument of this complexity, Schmidt argued that Göbekli Tepe may itself have been a driver of agricultural development in the region. His reasoning ran as follows. If large numbers of people were gathering regularly at this ceremonial site, the practical challenge of feeding them would have created powerful incentives to cultivate rather than simply forage. The pressure of sustaining those gatherings may have pushed the local population toward the deliberate management of wild grain and the penning of wild animals, the early steps of domestication. This would mean that organized religion, or at least organized ritual, came before and perhaps caused agriculture rather than following from it. It is a compelling hypothesis, and there is some supporting evidence. Genetic studies of early domesticated einkorn wheat have traced its origins to wild populations in precisely the region surrounding Göbekli Tepe. However, it remains a hypothesis rather than a proven mechanism. The evidence is suggestive but not conclusive, and the causal chain connecting the site to the domestication of nearby wild crops has not been definitively established. The enclosures themselves add further complexity to any interpretation. The site contains at least 20 distinct circular structures, each consisting of 2 large central pillars surrounded by a ring of smaller ones, the whole arrangement set within stone walls. The central pillars in the largest enclosures, designated Enclosure D, stand roughly 18 feet tall and feature carved arms along their sides, suggesting that they were meant to represent anthropomorphic figures of some kind, beings with human attributes, though their precise identity or significance is unknown. The animal carvings distributed across the pillars do not obviously form a narrative or map onto any known mythology from the region, though several researchers have proposed astronomical interpretations, suggesting that specific arrangements of animals correspond to star positions or seasonal markers. These interpretations remain contested. What is not contested is that the carvings were executed with considerable deliberateness and skill, which implies both a tradition of artistic practice and a shared symbolic vocabulary among the builders, neither of which a purely opportunistic or improvised gathering would easily produce. There is also the question of what happened to the site after it was built. The enclosures were not abandoned in the ordinary sense, they were deliberately filled in. At some point, the builders apparently chose to bury the structures under tons of rubble and earth, sealing the pillars and the carvings beneath the hillside. This act of deliberate interment preserved the site remarkably well. It is partly why the carvings remain in such good condition, but it also raises the question of why it was done. Ritual closure of sacred spaces is known from other ancient cultures, but the scale of the infilling at Göbekli Tepe is substantial, and no explanation for it commands general agreement. Schmidt made the decision, before his death, to deliberately rebury portions of the site that had already been excavated, a choice driven by conservation concerns and the recognition that future technologies would be capable of extracting information from the site that current methods cannot. That decision reflects a particular intellectual honesty about the limits of what is currently knowable. The site has been studied intensively for 3 decades, and it has answered some questions while multiplying others. The approximate date of construction is established. The physical character of the structures is well documented. The identity and social organization of the builders remain subjects of active and unresolved scholarly debate, and with only about 5% of the site excavated, its entire lie possible that the most disruptive evidence hasn't even been found yet. If you want to explore discoveries like this in more depth, there are a few carefully selected books and research resources linked in the description that go far beyond what we can cover here. Around 2600 BC, while Sargon of Akkad was still centuries away from founding his empire, a civilization was already thriving across what is now Pakistan and northwestern India that was in many ways more sophisticated than anything else on Earth at the time. The Indus Valley civilization, sometimes called the Harappan civilization after one of its principal cities, stretched across an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. At its height, it may have supported a population of several million people, distributed across hundreds of settlements ranging from small villages to substantial urban centers. The two largest of these cities, Mohenjo-Daro in what is now southern Pakistan and Harappa, several hundred miles to the northeast, were built on a scale that genuinely surprises modern archaeologists encountering them for the first time. What makes these cities particularly striking is the evidence of what appears to be centralized planning, though the nature of that authority remains unclear. The streets of Mohenjo-Daro were laid out on a grid, oriented to catch the prevailing winds and keep the residential neighborhoods relatively cool. Beneath those streets ran a drainage system so well engineered that some scholars have argued it surpassed anything in the ancient world, channeling wastewater away from homes through covered brick channels that connected to larger municipal drains. The civilization also used a standardized system of weights and measures, with cuboid stone weights found at sites hundreds of miles apart, conforming to the same ratios. This kind of standardization implies coordination across an enormous geographic area, yet no palace complex, no obvious seat of central government, and no monumental royal tomb has ever been found. The Indus people left behind a civilization without a clear ruler, which is itself a puzzle. But that puzzle is almost secondary to the one that has occupied linguists and historians for the better part of a century. They also left behind a script, carved onto small steatite seals, inscribed on copper tablets and pottery stamped into clay. The writing system of the Indus Valley appears on thousands of recovered objects from excavations at Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, and dozens of smaller sites. Scholars have catalogued somewhere between 400 and 700 distinct signs, depending on how sign variants are counted. And the script has been documented consistently enough that researchers are confident it represents a genuine system of some kind rather than random decoration. The signs run right to left across the face of the seals. They include geometric shapes, abstract symbols, and depictions of animals, most notably a humped bull and a figure that archaeologists sometimes call the unicorn, though it almost certainly depicts a real animal shown in profile. Despite more than 100 years of serious scholarly effort, nobody has deciphered it. The core problem is a near-total absence of the conditions that have allowed other ancient scripts to be cracked. The Egyptian hieroglyphs yielded to the Rosetta Stone, a single artifact that presented the same decree in 3 scripts, one of which was Greek that scholars could already read. Linear B, the Mycenaean Greek script, was eventually decoded, partly because the language it encoded turned out to be an archaic form of Greek, a known language. The Indus script has no equivalent. There is no bilingual inscription, no parallel text in a language anyone can read. There is also no confirmed descendant language. Whatever the Indus people spoke, it disappeared along with their cities, and attempts to connect it to any surviving language family have produced more controversy than consensus. Compounding the difficulty is the sheer brevity of the inscriptions. The average Indus seal inscription contains roughly 5 signs. Some contain only 1 or 2. A few of the longer clay tablet texts reach perhaps a dozen signs, which is still extraordinarily short for anyone attempting to reverse engineer a language from scratch. A linguist trying to decode an unknown language from 5-word samples with no dictionary and no related language is working under constraints that border on the impossible. This is why the script has resisted every serious attempt at decipherment, and why estimates of when or whether it will be decoded vary enormously among specialists. The fundamental disagreement among scholars concerns what the script actually is. One camp maintains it is a full writing system, a notation of spoken language in the way that Egyptian hieroglyphs or cuneiform encoded speech. If this is true, then the inscriptions on the seals contain words, names, titles, or sentences that could in principle be decoded if the right key were ever found. The opposing camp argues the script is better understood as a proto-writing system, a set of symbols encoding information about identity, ownership, or religious affiliation without necessarily representing spoken language in the way a phonetic or logographic script would. On this view, the seals might be read roughly as labels, identifying a merchant, a clan, a commodity, or a deity, without the signs ringing together into sentences that could be translated. A significant piece of evidence bearing on this debate emerged in 2009 when Rajesh Rao, a computational neuroscientist at the University of Washington, and his colleagues published a statistical analysis of the script's structure. They measured the conditional entropy of the sign sequences, essentially a mathematical measure of how much information each sign carries given the signs around it, and found that this entropy value closely matched those of known linguistic systems, including Sanskrit, Sumerian, and English. It was notably higher than the entropy values produced by non-linguistic systems like DNA sequences or computer code. Rao's team argued this was strong evidence that the Indus script encodes language rather than functioning as a simple set of labels or clan markers. The analysis generated significant attention and considerable debate. Critics pointed out that conditional entropy alone cannot confirm a script encodes spoken language, and that artificially generated sequences can sometimes produce similar values. The study did not decode a single sign, but it did push back meaningfully against the proto-writing interpretation, and most specialists today lean toward the view that the script encodes language of some kind, even if nobody can read it. There is also a political dimension to the decipherment question that has complicated scholarly debate for decades. Some Indian nationalist scholars and researchers affiliated with the Hindutva intellectual tradition have argued that the Indus script encodes an early form of Sanskrit, or a closely related Indo-Aryan language. This argument carries significant implications, because it would connect the Indus Valley people directly to the Vedic civilization that produced the Sanskrit texts, effectively making the Harappans the ancestors of later Hindu culture. The mainstream archaeological and linguistic consensus rejects this interpretation firmly. The prevailing view holds that the Indus Valley civilization predates the arrival of Indo-Aryan languages in the subcontinent, and that the Langu, age encoded in the script, if it encodes one at all, was more likely a Dravidian language or something unrelated to the Indo-Aryan family entirely. Attempts to demonstrate a Sanskrit connection have generally relied on selective sign interpretations that other specialists have found unconvincing. The debate has not been resolved on purely academic grounds, partly because the political stakes have made it difficult for some participants to engage the evidence without prior commitments. What remains is a writing system that was used continuously for several centuries across one of the ancient world's great civilizations, appearing on objects traded as far away as Mesopotamia, and that has yielded essentially nothing to the people studying it. The seals presumably identified merchants or commodities. The inscriptions presumably said something meaningful to the people reading them. But that meaning has been inaccessible for more than 3,000 years, and there is no current consensus on when or whether it might be recovered. For those interested in going deeper into the evidence and theories behind mysteries like this, there are additional resources linked below that expand on what we've covered. The civilization collapsed around 1900 BC. The cities were abandoned, and whatever the script said it in silence from that point forward. High on the Bolivian altiplano, at nearly 13,000 feet above sea level, there is a scatter of enormous carved stone blocks that has been fueling arguments between archaeologists and cable television producers for the better part of 4 decades. Puma Punku sits within the broader Tiwanaku complex, located in western Bolivia near the southern shore of Lake Titicaca, and it was built by the Tiwanaku people somewhere between roughly 500 and 800 AD. The Tiwanaku were, by the standards of their time and region, an extraordinarily sophisticated culture. They built cities, developed complex agricultural terracing systems, and maintained trade networks across a significant portion of the Andes. Puma Punku itself appears to have been a ceremonial platform of some kind, though the exact function, much like the script discussed earlier, remains a matter of scholarly debate rather than settled consensus. What visitors and researchers actually encounter at the site is, by any measure, striking. Enormous stone blocks lie scattered across the ground, some of them weighing upward of 130 tons, carved from red sandstone and a harder grey andesite. The blocks are not rough-hewn. They feature flat, smooth surfaces, precise right angles, and interlocking shapes that appear to have been designed to fit together like components of a larger assembly. Among the most frequently discussed are the so-called H-blocks, a series of identically shaped pieces that look, at first glance, as though they were produced by the same machine to the same specifications. The craftsmanship, however it was achieved, is genuinely impressive, and that much is not seriously disputed by anyone who has studied the site in person. The mystery, however, deepens considerably when you consider what the Tiwanaku did not have. They left no written records. They had no iron tools. They had no wheel. And the nearest known quarry for the grey andesite, used in some of the most precisely carved blocks, sits roughly 55 miles away on the other side of Lake Titicaca. The red sandstone is somewhat closer, but still requires substantial transport over difficult terrain. So the fundamental questions that Puma Punku raises are straightforward to state and genuinely difficult to answer. How were these blocks quarried with such apparent precision? How were they transported to this location? And how were they shaped and fitted without the tools that most people instinctively assume would be necessary for work of this quality? The mainstream archaeological interpretation is more measured than popular accounts tend to suggest. Most researchers who have studied Puma Punku in depth argue that the Tiwanaku were skilled craftsmen operating with stone, bone and bronze tools, using sand abrasion techniques for polishing and finishing surfaces, and drawing on organized communal labor to move heavy materials. None of these methods are particularly exotic. Experimental archaeology has repeatedly demonstrated that ancient peoples working without iron or the wheel could achieve results that look, to modern eyes, implausibly refined. The precision at Puma Punku is real, but the claim that it exceeds what pre-industrial human craftsmanship could produce is, according to most specialists, not well supported by the evidence. The H-blocks deserve particular attention here because they are frequently cited as the single most compelling piece of evidence for some kind of advanced or anomalous construction technology. The popular argument holds that all the H-blocks are perfectly identical and interchangeable, implying industrial-level standardization. Archaeologists who have examined the blocks directly note that this characterization is not quite accurate. The blocks do show variation, some fit together and others do not. And the impression of perfect uniformity is, in part, a product of how the blocks are typically photographed, close up, from angles that emphasize symmetry and suppress irregularity. This is not to say the blocks are crude, they are not, but the claim of machine-like perfection is somewhat overstated, and that overstatement has, in the view of many researchers, obscured rather than clarified the genuine questions the site poses. The transport question is similarly real but similarly overstated in popular discussion. Moving a 130-ton block without a wheel is not in principle impossible. Experimental work has shown that reed boats, of the kind the Tiwanaku had access to, are capable of carrying substantial loads across Lake Titicaca, and that heavy stones can be hauled on wooden sledges over prepared surfaces using coordinated human or animal labor. The logistics would have been demanding. They would have required substantial planning and a large, organized workforce. But demanding and inexplicable are not the same thing, and the transport problem at Puma Punku, while genuine, falls within the range of what archaeologists consider achievable for a complex pre-industrial society. What is harder to explain, and what receives somewhat less attention in popular accounts fixated on the precision of the stonework, is the current state of the site itself. Puma Punku does not look like a monument that was simply abandoned and left to weather over time. It looks, in many respects, like a monument that was violently disrupted. Massive stones are toppled. Blocks that were presumably part of standing structures lie broken and scattered across a wide area. The leading explanations for this are earthquake damage and deliberate dismantling, possibly both at different points in history. Some researchers have suggested that stones from Puma Punku were later carried away and reused in construction elsewhere in the region. The precise sequence of events that produced the current scatter of ruins is not well established, and the destruction itself has complicated efforts to understand what the original structure actually looked like and how its components were intended to relate to one another. Radiocarbon dating of organic material from the site has helped establish the construction timeline reasonably well, and there is broad scholarly agreement that Puma Punku was built and in use during the florescence of Tiwanaku culture. The dating does not, in itself, resolve the construction questions, but it does firmly situate the site within a historical context where a sophisticated Andean civilization was operating, which is relevant when evaluating claims that the stonework is inexplicable without invoking some external or anomalous influence. That particular claim, that the precision of Puma Punku cannot be accounted for by the Tiwanaku themselves and therefore implies a more advanced or possibly non-human source of knowledge, is where archaeologists and a significant segment of popular media part ways most sharply. The archaeological consensus holds that there is no evidence for such a conclusion, and that the techniques required to produce the stonework at Puma Punku, while sophisticated, are consistent with what a highly organized and skilled pre-industrial culture could accomplish over time. The evidence gap, from a scholarly perspective, is not a gap between the Tiwanaku's capabilities and the demands of the construction. It is a gap in the documentary record, the absence of written accounts, the limited survival of tools and organic materials, and the disturbed state of the site itself that prevents a full reconstruction of the specific methods used. That is, in the end, a genuine and unresolved problem. We know the blocks are there. We know approximately when they were made. We have reasonable hypotheses about how they were carved and transported. But the chain of direct evidence connecting the Tiwanaku's known tools and organizational capacity to the specific techniques that produce these specific stones has not been fully assembled, and the destroyed and scattered condition of the site makes it unlikely that it ever will be completely. The real mystery at Puma Punku isn't whether human hands built it, it's that we still can't fully trace the line between what we know about how they worked and what the stones themselves seem to be telling us. If you're drawn to questions like this, you'll find a curated selection of deeper research and reading in the description that explores these mysteries in greater detail. In 1986, a diving instructor named Kihachiro Aratake was exploring the waters of Yonaguni, a small Japanese island closer to Taiwan than it is to the Japanese mainland, when he came across something on the ocean floor that he couldn't quite account for. What Aratake found sitting roughly 25 meters beneath the surface was a massive stone formation, unlike anything he had seen while diving those waters before. The structure presented a series of broad, stepstone terraces, flat platforms cut at what appeared to be right angles, and what looked, to any reasonable observer, like deliberately shaped walls, columns, and a long flat feature that divers have compared to a road, or a staircase carved into the rock. The main formation stretches roughly 150 meters from east to west and about 40 meters from north to south, rising approximately 27 meters from the seafloor near its highest point. The central dispute is one of the most genuinely unresolved arguments in this entire field, and it comes down to a deceptively simple question. Did human hands shape this, or did nature do it alone? Those are not, it should be noted, mutually exclusive possibilities. A third option, which several researchers have entertained, is that a naturally occurring formation was subsequently modified and elaborated upon by people who found it useful. But even that middle ground position requires establishing that people were present and working on this structure at the relevant time, which brings the question of timing into sharp focus. And the timing question is where things become genuinely extraordinary. The case for natural formation rests on the well-documented behavior of sandstone under erosion. Sandstone of the type found at Yonaguni tends to fracture along parallel and perpendicular planes because of its layered internal structure, a property geologists call jointing. When waves, currents, and seismic activity work on such rock over thousands of years, the result can include flat surfaces, right-angle edges, and step-like formations that bear a striking visual resemblance to worked stone. Robert Schoch, a geologist from Boston University who became well known for his controversial reassessment of the Sphinx at Giza and who visited the Yonaguni site to examine it firsthand, concluded that the primary structure is natural in origin. Schoch noted that the features most often cited as evidence of human workmanship, the flat terraces, the angular cuts, the general geometry of the thing, are consistent with what sandstone does on its own when subjected to the geological and hydrological pressures present in that region. He acknowledged that some smaller features near the main structure were harder to explain entirely through natural processes, but his overall assessment came down firmly on the side of geology rather than archaeology. The Japanese government has, to this point, declined to recognize the Yonaguni Monument as a cultural property, which implicitly reflects the official position that human authorship has not been established to a sufficient standard. On the other side of the argument stands Masaki Kimura, a marine geologist from the University of the Ryukyus who spent years diving the Yonaguni site and became its most prominent scientific advocate for the man-made interpretation. Kimura documented what he described as tool marks on certain stone surfaces, stones that appeared to have been moved or repositioned from their natural orientation, and features including what he identified as a possible carved staircase and a structure resembling a ceremonial arch. He also pointed out that the concentration of angular geometric features at the Yonaguni site is not replicated on the surrounding seabed, which one might expect if natural fracturing alone were responsible. In Kimura's assessment, the cumulative weight of these anomalies pushes the formation beyond what geology alone can comfortably explain. He estimated, based on his surveys, that the monument encompasses 10 separate structures across a large area of the seafloor, and argued that the site represents the remnants of a sunken city or ceremonial complex. The problem is that neither position can be settled by the evidence currently available. The tool marks Kimura identified are real points of contention, but tool marks on submerged sandstone are notoriously difficult to distinguish from erosion patterns, and without controlled excavation, the interpretation remains open. The stones that appear to have been repositioned are similarly ambiguous. Current activity and seismic events can move large stones, and without stratigraphic analysis of the kind that requires excavation rather than just observation, it's not possible to say definitively that human agency was involved. This is where the timing question becomes so consequential. If the Yonaguni Monument is a human construction, then it was built while it was still above water, which means before the sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age. Sea levels in that part of the Pacific were substantially lower during the last glacial maximum, and the area around Yonaguni would have been dry land somewhere between roughly 10,000 and 12,000 years ago. That date would place the construction of the monument well before the oldest confirmed large-scale stone structures anywhere on the planet. A contemporary or even older stone complex sitting underwater off the coast of Japan, built by a culture of which we have no other record, would represent something far more disruptive to the existing picture of prehistory, see human capability, than almost any other discovery one could imagine. The stakes of this question, in other words, are unusually high, and that may partly explain why the debate around it has been so persistent and so difficult to resolve with anything approaching scientific consensus. There are features of the site that the natural formation argument handles less comfortably than others. A circular stone feature that Kimura identified and described as a potential ceremonial area, along with what appears to be a pair of standing stones near the main structure, strikes some observers as too specifically arranged to be entirely coincidental. There are also what look like drainage channels running along some of the flat surfaces, though the interpretation of these features depends heavily on which photographs you examine and which expert is guiding the analysis. This is a recurring methodological problem at Yonaguni. The site is large enough and visually complex enough that selective documentation can produce quite different impressions of what it actually looks like, and Mike's saint of the public engagement with the monument happens through a body of photography and video footage that is not representative of the whole formation. The deeper difficulty is that underwater archaeological investigation is an entirely different enterprise from conventional land-based excavation. At a site like Göbekli Tepe or Puma Punku, researchers can bring teams of excavators in for extended seasons, remove and analyze sediment layers, conduct geophysical surveys, and build up a stratigraphic record that establishes the sequence of events at the site over time. None of that is straightforward underwater. Visibility, current, dive depth, and the sheer physical difficulty of sustained work beneath the surface all constrain what investigators can accomplish, and a systematic excavation of the Yonaguni site, the kind that would definitively answer whether it was shaped by people, has never been conducted. What we have instead is a large collection of dive surveys, measurements, photographs, and competing expert opinions, none of which has been sufficient to close the argument in either direction. What can be said with confidence is that the Yonaguni Monument is a genuinely unusual geological feature, that serious researchers on both sides of the debate have examined it and reached opposite conclusions, and that the question of its origin has not been resolved by anything currently in the evidentiary record. Whether that changes depends almost entirely on whether anyone undertakes the kind of sustained, systematic, underwater investigation that the site has never received. And given how difficult and expensive sustained underwater archaeology actually is, the evidence that would settle this cleanly may simply never come. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like, as it genuinely helps the channel reach more people who are interested in this kind of content. Subscribing is also greatly appreciated. If you know two people who find ancient history and unsolved mysteries compelling, sharing this video with them directly goes a long way. These topics take a considerable amount of research to put together, and the support means a great deal. Plus, if you'd like to help me keep expanding, don't forget to explore my other channels that explore current unsolved cases and factual crime stories.